The fork was halfway to my mouth when I noticed Patricia watching me from across the kitchen counter. Her eyes weren't on the conversation David was having with his brother Michael about weekend plans. They weren't following Susan's animated story about her kids' soccer tournament. They were locked on my plate, tracking every movement of my hand with an intensity that made my stomach clench before I'd even taken a bite. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The lasagna looked perfect, as always. Layers of pasta, ricotta, and meat sauce arranged with the precision of someone who'd been perfecting family recipes for 30 years. Steam rose from the ceramic dish in delicate spirals, carrying the scent of oregano and garlic through Patricia's immaculate dining room. Everyone else had already started eating, complimenting her cooking between bites, but something made me pause. Maybe it was the way she'd insisted on serving me personally, spooning an extra large portion onto my plate while everyone else helped themselves. Maybe it was how she'd lingered behind my chair, her hands resting on my shoulders just a moment too long as she set the plate down. Or maybe it was the smile that didn't quite reach her eyes when she said, "I made this one especially for you, Emma. I know how much you love my cooking." I set the fork down gently, claiming I needed water first, and watched her face fall for just a split second before the practiced smile returned. That micro-expression told me everything I needed to know about what was really happening at these weekly Sunday dinners. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and what I'm about to tell you isn't just about food poisoning or difficult in-laws. It's about survival, evidence, and what happens when someone underestimates exactly how far you'll go to protect yourself and the family you're trying to build. 8 months earlier, I'd walked into Patricia Williams' house as David's new wife, nervous but hopeful about joining a family that seemed so different from my own chaotic childhood. My parents had divorced when I was 12, leaving me bouncing between apartments and relatives until I aged out of the system. David's family appeared stable, rooted, traditional. Patricia had been cooking Sunday dinners for her 2 sons since they were children, and the ritual continued even after they'd moved out and started their own lives. The first few dinners were awkward but manageable. Patricia would ask polite questions about my teaching job at Maple Grove High School, nod approvingly when David mentioned our apartment renovation plans, and share stories about David's childhood that made him blush and laugh. She seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me, though there was always an undercurrent of evaluation in her questions. Where exactly was your family from? What kind of traditions did you grow up with? Do you plan to keep working after you have children? I understood the protective mother instincts. David was her baby, the younger of 2 sons, and she'd raised him as a single parent after her husband died when David was in high school. Their bond was strong, maybe stronger than what I was used to seeing between mothers and adult sons, but I respected it. I wanted to be part of it. The problem started small. Comments about my cooking that were framed as helpful suggestions. Observations about my housekeeping when she dropped by unannounced to bring David leftovers. Subtle corrections about family traditions I was supposedly misunderstanding. When David and I announced our engagement, she'd smiled and hugged us both, but later I overheard her on the phone with Michael's wife Susan, saying she just hoped David knew what he was getting into, marrying someone with no family background to speak of. I told myself it was adjustment period difficulties. Patricia had been the primary woman in David's life for over a decade. Of course, sharing that role would feel threatening. I made extra efforts to include her in wedding planning, asked for her opinion on everything from flowers to music, and even incorporated several of her suggestions into our ceremony. She seemed pleased, and David was relieved that his 2 favorite women were getting along so well. The wedding day itself was beautiful. Patricia wore the navy dress we'd picked out together, and gave a heartfelt speech about welcoming me into the family. She'd even learned a few phrases in Spanish to acknowledge my heritage, which touched me more than I expected. For a moment, standing there in my wedding dress with David's hand in mine and Patricia's genuine smile beaming at us, I felt like I'd finally found the stable family I'd always wanted. But families, I was learning, are complicated ecosystems. When you add a new member, everything shifts, and not everyone adapts well to change. The first sign of real trouble came 3 weeks into our marriage. We'd miss Sunday dinner because I'd come down with food poisoning after eating at a new restaurant downtown. I'd spent the entire weekend alternating between the bathroom and the couch, too weak to do much besides sleep and sip ginger ale. David had stayed home to take care of me, bringing me soup and checking my temperature every few hours. When I finally felt well enough to venture out again, Patricia greeted us at her door with an expression of concern that felt almost theatrical. She fussed over me, insisting I looked too thin, and immediately began preparing what she called her special recovery meal: chicken soup with homemade noodles, fresh bread, and a fruit salad with what she claimed were immune-boosting ingredients she'd researched specifically for my condition. I should have been touched by the gesture. Instead, something about the way she watched me eat made my appetite disappear. Every spoonful felt like a performance, and Patricia was the most attentive audience member, commenting on my color, my energy level, how much better I looked with each bite. David seemed oblivious to the intensity of her attention, chatting normally with Michael about work while I struggled through the meal under his mother's unwavering gaze. That night, I was sick again. Not as severely as the weekend before, but enough to spend hours in the bathroom while David rubbed my back and worried aloud about whether I'd picked up some kind of chronic stomach condition. I blamed it on eating too much too soon after being ill, but something nagged at me. The timing felt too coincidental. Over the next month, a pattern emerged that I initially attributed to stress and coincidence. Every Sunday dinner at Patricia's house was followed by stomach issues that began 2 to 3 hours after we got home. Sometimes it was mild nausea that lasted until morning. Other times it was more severe, leaving me weak and dehydrated for days. David started joking that his mother's rich cooking was too much for my delicate teacher stomach, but his concern was growing. I tried everything I could think of. I ate smaller portions, avoided the dishes with the most dairy, skipped dessert entirely. Nothing seemed to help. Meanwhile, Patricia's attention to my health became more intense. She'd call the next day to check on me, suggest remedies she'd researched online, and even offered to adjust her recipes to accommodate what she assumed was a sensitive digestive system. The concern felt genuine enough.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That I began to wonder if I was developing some kind of food intolerance or autoimmune condition. I made an appointment with my doctor, underwent a series of tests, and even kept a detailed food diary to identify potential triggers. Everything came back normal, leaving my physician to suggest that stress from adjusting to married life might be manifesting as physical symptoms. David was supportive, but increasingly frustrated. He couldn't understand why I kept getting sick, and I could see the worry in his eyes every Sunday evening as he watched me push food around my plate, trying to eat enough to be polite, while dreading the inevitable consequences. He started suggesting we skip dinner occasionally, which always resulted in hurt phone calls from Patricia about how the family was drifting apart and how important these traditions were for maintaining close relationships. The breaking point came on a rainy Sunday in October. I'd been feeling particularly good that week, energetic and optimistic in a way I hadn't experienced in months. David and I had spent Saturday hiking in the state park, planning future trips, and talking about maybe starting to try for children in the next year or two. I was actually looking forward to dinner at his mother's house for the first time in weeks. Patricia seemed especially pleased to see us that evening. She'd prepared an elaborate meal with multiple courses, explaining that she'd been experimenting with new recipes and wanted our opinions. The dining room table was set with her good china, candles were flickering in crystal holders, and soft jazz played from the stereo in the corner. It felt celebratory, though no one had mentioned any particular occasion worth celebrating. Michael and Susan were there with their two young children, who provided helpful distraction from Patricia's usual intense focus on my eating habits. While she was busy cutting food into child-sized portions and wiping faces, I was able to eat more normally, actually enjoying the conversation and the sense of family togetherness I'd been craving. The main course was her famous lasagna, the recipe she'd inherited from her own mother and perfected over decades of Sunday dinners. She served everyone family style from the large casserole dish, but when it came to my plate, she insisted on going back to the kitchen for what she called a special piece she'd kept warm just for me. The portion was enormous, nearly twice the size of what everyone else received, and she explained that she'd added extra cheese to the corner section because she remembered me mentioning that I loved ricotta. I hadn't mentioned anything about ricotta, but I thanked her for the thoughtfulness and started eating. The lasagna was delicious, as always, though there was something slightly different about the flavor that I couldn't quite identify. Maybe a new herb blend, or a different brand of cheese. Whatever it was, it didn't taste bad, just unfamiliar in a way that made me pay more attention to each bite than usual. Patricia watched me eat with the same intense focus I'd grown accustomed to, but this time there was something else in her expression. Satisfaction, maybe, or anticipation. She kept asking if I liked the special preparation, if the flavors were coming through properly, if I thought the seasoning was balanced. Her questions felt less like a cook seeking feedback and more like someone waiting for a specific reaction. 2 hours later, I was in the emergency room at Maple Grove General Hospital, doubled over with stomach cramps that felt like someone was twisting knives through my abdomen. The nausea was so severe, I couldn't keep down even small sips of water, and David was pacing the waiting room while I underwent tests to determine what had made me so violently ill. The doctors initially suspected severe food poisoning, possibly from contaminated meat or dairy products. They asked detailed questions about everything I'd eaten in the past 24 hours, and when I mentioned Sunday dinner at my mother-in-law's house, they suggested that other family members might start showing similar symptoms if there had been contamination in the shared meal. But no one else got sick. Not David, who'd eaten from the same casserole dish, not Michael or Susan or their children, who'd shared all the same side dishes and dessert. Only me, and only from the special portion Patricia had served personally. When I mentioned this to the attending physician, she paused in her note-taking and asked if I'd eaten anything that others hadn't. I told her about the corner piece with extra cheese and saw something shift in her expression. She excused herself to make some phone calls, and when she returned, she was accompanied by someone from hospital security and a police officer who introduced himself as Detective Martinez from the Maple Grove Police Department. That's when I realized this wasn't just food poisoning. This was something much more deliberate, much more dangerous, and much more personal than I'd ever imagined possible. The tests revealed traces of a substance that didn't belong in lasagna or any other food, something that explained the months of Sunday evening sickness, the pattern of symptoms that only affected me, and the way Patricia's eyes had tracked my every bite with such focused intensity. As I lay in that hospital bed, connected to IV fluids and waiting for the cramping to subside, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. I wasn't going to make excuses or give anyone the benefit of the doubt. I was going to find out exactly what had been happening in that house, and I was going to make sure it never happened to anyone else. But first, I had to survive long enough to expose the truth, and Patricia Williams had no idea that her newest daughter-in-law was about to become her most dangerous opponent. Part 2. The discharge paperwork crinkled in my hands as David helped me into our Honda Civic outside Maple Grove General Hospital. 48 hours of IV fluids, blood tests, and concerned medical staff had left me weak but clear-headed. Detective Martinez had taken my statement twice, asking detailed questions about family dynamics, recent conflicts, and access to my food. Each question felt like a small validation of what my gut had been telling me for months. David's face was a map of confusion and guilt as he navigated the familiar streets back to our apartment on Oak Avenue. He kept glancing at me sideways, opening his mouth to speak, and then closing it again. Finally, as we sat at the red light 2 blocks from home, he said what had been weighing on both our minds since the doctor first mentioned the word poisoning. "Emma, I need you to know that my mother would never deliberately hurt anyone. There has to be an explanation for this that doesn't involve her trying to poison you." His voice carried the strain of someone trying to convince himself as much as me. Maybe there was cross-contamination in her kitchen, or maybe she accidentally grabbed the wrong ingredient. Mom's been under a lot of stress lately with the catering business picking up. I understood his need to find rational explanations. Patricia wasn't just his mother, she was his hero, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him and Michael after their father's death. The idea that she might deliberately harm his wife challenged everything he believed about family, loyalty, and the woman who had shaped his entire worldview. But I'd had 48 hours to think while lying in that hospital bed, replaying every Sunday dinner, every strange comment, every moment when Patricia's behavior had felt just slightly off. The pattern was too consistent, too targeted, to be accidental. The timing was too convenient, and my symptoms were too specific to be coincidental. "David, I want to believe that too," I said gently, reaching across the center console to squeeze his hand. "But we need to be smart about this. The hospital found something in my system that shouldn't be there. Detective Martinez is treating this as a criminal investigation. We can't just pretend everything is normal and hope it goes away." The light turned green, and David drove the remaining blocks in silence. Our apartment felt different when we walked through the door, as if the events of the weekend had shifted something fundamental about our sense of safety and home. I settled onto the couch, while David busied himself in the kitchen, making tea and toast, with the focused intensity of someone trying to solve a problem through action. My phone had been buzzing with messages and calls since word of my hospitalization had spread through David's family. Michael had texted several times, asking for updates and offering to help with anything we needed. Susan had sent a long message about being available to talk if I wanted another woman's perspective on family stress and health issues. Even Patricia had called twice, leaving voicemails that David played for me on speaker. Her voice in those messages was everything you'd expect from a concerned mother-in-law: worry about my health, offers to bring soup or run errands, apologies for whatever had gone wrong with dinner on Sunday. If I hadn't spent 2 days in a hospital bed with poison in my bloodstream, her concern would have seemed touching, even maternal. Instead, every word felt calculated, performed for an audience that included David and potentially law enforcement. The third message was different. Patricia's voice was still warm and concerned, but there was an edge underneath that hadn't been there before. She mentioned how terrible she felt about the whole situation, how she couldn't understand what might have gone wrong, and how she hoped we wouldn't let this unfortunate incident affect our family relationships. The word incident struck me as particularly deliberate. Not accident, not tragedy, not crisis. Incident, as if my hospitalization was just an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a potential crime. "She wants to come over tomorrow," David said, setting a cup of chamomile tea on the coffee table in front of me. "She's worried about you, and she thinks maybe if we all sit down and talk through what happened, we can figure out where things went wrong." The idea of Patricia in our apartment, in our safe space, made my stomach clench in a way that had nothing to do with residual nausea, but I also recognized an opportunity. If she was willing to come here, to our territory, maybe I could observe her behavior more objectively. Maybe I could ask the right questions and watch her reactions without the familiar comfort of her own kitchen to shield her. "Okay," I said, surprising both of us. But I want to record the conversation for our own protection, and so we have a clear record of what everyone says. David frowned. Emma, that feels like we're treating her as a suspect rather than family. Recording your own mother-in-law seems pretty extreme. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. David, someone put something in my food that landed me in the hospital. The police are investigating this as a crime. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but I'm also not going to pretend that normal family dynamics apply when we're dealing with potential poisoning. If your mother is innocent, then recording our conversation will help establish that. If she's not, then we need evidence. He looked uncomfortable, but after a long moment, he nodded. I still can't believe we're even having this conversation. 6 months ago, you two were planning wedding menus together. That was exactly the problem. 6 months ago, I'd been the grateful new daughter-in-law, eager to please, and quick to excuse behavior that should have raised red flags. I'd wanted so desperately to belong to a stable family that I'd ignored my own instincts about Patricia's possessiveness and control. I'd interpreted her intense interest in my eating habits as motherly concern rather than something more sinister. But people reveal themselves gradually, and stress has a way of accelerating that process. My marriage to David had shifted the family dynamic in ways Patricia clearly wasn't handling well. The question was whether her poor handling had escalated from emotional manipulation to physical harm. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Patricia's face watching me eat, that expression of satisfaction and anticipation that I'd dismissed as normal maternal pride in her cooking. Now it felt ominous, like she'd been waiting for something specific to happen. I kept replaying the dinner conversation, trying to remember if she'd said anything revealing, any clues I might have missed, while I was focused on being polite and grateful. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and moved to the living room with my laptop. If I was going to start taking this situation seriously, I needed to understand what we might be dealing with. I researched food poisoning symptoms, the specific substance the hospital had found in my blood, and the legal process for prosecuting poisoning cases. The information was sobering and scary, but also empowering. Knowledge felt like the first step toward protecting myself. I also started a detailed timeline of every Sunday dinner, every strange symptom, every comment Patricia had made that felt off. Writing it all down revealed patterns I hadn't fully recognized while living through them. The escalation had been gradual but consistent. The targeting had been precise. And the timing aligned perfectly with moments when David and I had made decisions about our future that reduced Patricia's central role in our lives. Our engagement announcement had been followed by the first severe bout of food poisoning. The week we'd started talking about maybe skipping some Sunday dinners to establish our own traditions had coincided with my worst symptoms yet. And the most recent incident had come just days after I'd mentioned to David that we should start thinking about trying for children soon. Children, the realization hit me like a physical blow. If David and I had children, Patricia's role as the primary woman in his life would be permanently diminished. She'd go from being his most important relationship to being a grandmother, valuable, but no longer central. For someone who had built her entire identity around being David's devoted mother, that transition might feel like losing everything. By the time David woke up the next morning, I had pages of notes, a timeline that revealed clear patterns, and a growing understanding of what we were really dealing with. This wasn't just about difficult family dynamics or adjustment issues between women competing for David's attention. This was about power, control, and someone who was willing to use extreme measures to maintain their position in the family hierarchy. Patricia arrived at our apartment promptly at 10, carrying a covered dish that she announced was homemade chicken soup. The irony of bringing food to someone who'd just been hospitalized for poisoning seemed lost on her, but David accepted the container with gratitude and immediate plans to heat some up for lunch. Absolutely not, I said more sharply than I'd intended. Both David and Patricia turned to stare at me, and I realized I'd revealed more of my suspicion than was probably strategic. I mean, thank you, Patricia, but the doctor recommended I stick to very bland foods for a few more days. Maybe David can have some later. Patricia's smile flickered, just for a moment, before returning to full brightness. Of course, dear. I should have thought about dietary restrictions after what you've been through. I'm just so eager to help in any way I can. She settled into our armchair with the familiarity of someone who considered our apartment an extension of her own territory. David sat beside me on the couch, and I discreetly activated the recording app on my phone, placing it on the coffee table where it could capture our conversation clearly. I've been thinking about Sunday dinner non-stop since you got sick, Patricia began, her voice heavy with maternal concern. I keep going over everything I did in the kitchen, trying to figure out what could have gone wrong. The only thing I can think of is that maybe I didn't clean my cutting boards properly between ingredients, or maybe there was something wrong with the meat I bought. It was a plausible explanation, delivered with exactly the right amount of worry and self-blame. If I hadn't spent the previous night researching and timeline building, I might have found it convincing. Instead, I found myself studying her body language, looking for tells that might reveal whether she was genuinely confused or skillfully deflecting. The hospital said it wasn't food poisoning from bacteria or contamination, I said carefully. They found a specific substance that wouldn't normally be in food. Patricia's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine shock. A substance? What kind of substance? As the concerned mother-in-law trying to help solve a mystery, and me asking careful questions designed to reveal inconsistencies in her story. By the time she left, I had a recording full of small contradictions, defensive responses, and subtle attempts to reframe my suspicions as evidence of my own instability. David walked his mother to her car, and I watched from our living room window as they had what appeared to be an intense conversation on the sidewalk. Patricia gestured emphatically while David nodded and shook his head in turn. When he returned to the apartment, his expression was troubled. "She's really hurt that you seem to suspect her of deliberately harming you," he said, settling back onto the couch beside me. "She thinks maybe you need to talk to someone about the stress you've been under, maybe see a therapist who can help you process what happened without jumping to conclusions about family members." It was a masterful manipulation. Patricia had managed to plant doubt about my mental state while positioning herself as the concerned mother-in-law worried about her daughter-in-law's psychological well-being. If I continued to insist that she might have poisoned me, I risked looking paranoid and unstable. If I backed down, I risked giving her the opportunity to try again. But I had advantages Patricia didn't know about. I had a recording of our conversation that revealed more than she probably realized. I had detailed documentation of patterns she thought I hadn't noticed. And I had access to technology that could provide the kind of evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. That afternoon, while David was at work, I drove to the electronics store in the shopping center across town. I bought 3 small security cameras with motion detection and audio recording capabilities, along with a system that would store footage in the cloud where it couldn't be tampered with or accidentally deleted. If Patricia Williams wanted to play games with my health and safety, she was about to discover that her opponent was much more prepared than she'd realized. Part 3: Installing security cameras in your own home should feel like a reasonable precaution for personal safety. Instead, as I positioned the first device in our living room bookshelf, angled to capture the kitchen and dining area, it felt like preparing for war. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially setting up surveillance to monitor my husband's mother, the woman who had welcomed me into the family with tearful hugs and promises of lifelong support. The cameras were small enough to blend invisibly among our books and decorations, but sophisticated enough to capture high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. More importantly, they were motion-activated and would automatically upload footage to a secure cloud server that only I could access. If something happened to me, if I became too sick to advocate for myself, the evidence would still exist. David returned from work that evening to find me curled up on the couch with my laptop, researching the specific compound the hospital had found in my bloodstream. His expression shifted from concern to confusion as he took in the technical articles I had open about plant-based toxins and their effects on human digestive systems. "Emma, what are you doing? The doctors are handling the investigation. Detective Martinez said they're running more tests and that we should just focus on your recovery." I closed the laptop and turned to face him fully. "David, I need you to understand something. The substance they found isn't something that could accidentally contaminate food. It's not a cleaning product residue or a natural occurrence. It's something that would have to be deliberately added to what I ate." His face went pale. "You're saying someone intentionally poisoned you?" "I'm saying the evidence suggests that yes. And I'm not going to wait for someone else to figure out who or why. This is my life we're talking about." David sat down heavily in the armchair his mother had occupied that morning. "If that's true, then we're talking about attempted murder. We're talking about someone we know, someone who sits at our dinner table and shares our family celebrations trying to kill my wife." The weight of it settled between us like a physical presence. We'd been dancing around the implications for days, using softer language like incident and unfortunate situation, but the clinical reality was exactly what David had just said. Someone had tried to kill me, and the most likely suspect was his mother. "I installed security cameras today," I said quietly. "If someone is targeting me, I want evidence of how they're doing it, and if I'm wrong, if there's some other explanation, the cameras will help prove that too." David's reaction surprised me. Instead of the resistance I'd expected, he just nodded slowly. "Where did you put them?" I showed him the 3 locations I'd chosen. One covering the living room and kitchen area where we entertained guests, one positioned to monitor our bedroom and the hallway leading to it, and one focused on our front door and entryway. The placement would capture anyone who entered our apartment, anything they brought with them, and any actions they took while they were here. The motion detection means they only record when someone's actually in the space, I explained, and they upload everything automatically, so even if something happened to the physical cameras, we'd still have the footage. David studied the camera positions with the analytical approach he brought to his IT work. "These are good quality, professional grade. But Emma, if we're at the point where we need surveillance equipment to feel safe in our own home, maybe we should consider staying somewhere else for a while." It was a tempting suggestion. We could pack some clothes and stay in a hotel, or drive to my cousin's place in Minneapolis until the police investigation concluded. We could remove ourselves from the situation entirely and let law enforcement handle whatever was happening, but running away wouldn't solve the fundamental problem. If Patricia was willing to poison me once, what would stop her from trying again when we returned? If she was capable of this level of deception and harm, what other family members might be at risk? And if we left town now, it would look like guilt or panic rather than reasonable caution. "I don't want to run," I said. "I want to know the truth. And I want evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away." We ordered takeout that night, instead of cooking, and David insisted on picking up the food himself rather than having it delivered. The precaution felt both necessary and surreal. Less than a week earlier, our biggest worry had been whether we could afford to renovate our bathroom this year. Now we were treating basic activities like eating and sleeping as potential security risks. The next morning brought a call from Detective Martinez with preliminary results from the expanded toxicology tests. The substance found in my blood was confirmed to be a compound derived from castor beans, specifically ricin, which explained both the severity of my symptoms and the delayed onset. Ricin poisoning could be fatal, but the amount I'd ingested had been calibrated to cause serious illness rather than immediate death. "The good news is that you're going to be fine," Detective Martinez said during our phone conversation. "The bad news is that this confirms we're dealing with intentional poisoning. Ricin doesn't occur naturally in food, and it's not something that could be accidentally introduced during normal cooking processes. The detective went on to explain that ricin required specific knowledge to extract and prepare, suggesting that whoever had poisoned me had either researched the process extensively or had previous experience with plant-based toxins. The amount used indicated someone who understood dosing, who wanted to cause harm without necessarily causing immediate death. We're going to need to interview everyone who had access to your food that night, Detective Martinez continued. That includes family members, anyone who helped with food preparation, and anyone who might have had opportunity to tamper with your plate specifically. David took the phone and provided the detective with contact information for Patricia, Michael, and Susan. He also mentioned that his mother operated a small catering business from her home, which might give her access to unusual ingredients or equipment that could be relevant to the investigation. After the call ended, we sat in silence for several minutes. The confirmation that I'd been deliberately poisoned with a potentially lethal substance transformed our situation from family drama to criminal investigation. There was no more room for benefit of the doubt or charitable interpretations of suspicious behavior. I need to call my mother and tell her what the police found, David said finally. She deserves to know that they'll be questioning her as part of the investigation. I understood his loyalty, but I also recognized the strategic disadvantage of giving Patricia advance warning about what the police knew and what questions they might ask. If she was guilty, the phone call would give her time to prepare answers, dispose of evidence, or coordinate stories with any potential accomplices. What if we don't tell her about the ricin specifically? I suggested. Just let her know that the police want to interview everyone who was at dinner, without giving her details about what they've discovered. David looked uncomfortable. That feels like we're setting a trap for her. David, if she's innocent, then answering questions honestly shouldn't be a problem. If she's guilty, then yes, I want her to walk into a trap. Someone tried to kill me with a poison that could have caused permanent organ damage or death. I'm not worried about playing fair with that person. He made the call that afternoon, and I listened from the kitchen as he explained to his mother that the police investigation had expanded, and that they wanted to interview everyone who had been present at Sunday dinner. Patricia's response was everything I'd expected: shock, concern, and immediate offers to cooperate fully with law enforcement. But there was something else in her voice, a note of calculation that suggested she was already thinking through implications and planning her responses. When David mentioned that the detective wanted to interview her at the police station rather than at her home, Patricia's tone shifted slightly. A police station seems so formal and intimidating, she said. I'm already stressed about this whole situation, and being interviewed like a criminal suspect might make it hard for me to think clearly. Would it be possible for the detective to come to my house instead? I'd feel more comfortable in familiar surroundings. David looked at me questioningly, and I shook my head firmly. Police interviews were more effective in controlled environments where distractions were minimized and the interviewee couldn't rely on familiar comforts to maintain composure. If Patricia was innocent, the location shouldn't matter. If she was guilty, her preference for home field advantage was telling. The detective specifically requested that interviews be conducted at the station, David told his mother. I think it's standard procedure for this type of investigation. Patricia's acquiescence was gracious but reluctant. She scheduled her interview for the following afternoon and spent the rest of the phone conversation expressing bewilderment about how such a terrible thing could have happened to someone she cared about so much. That evening, David and I discussed strategy for our own upcoming interviews with Detective Martinez. We would be questioned separately to ensure that our accounts were independent and consistent. I felt confident about my ability to provide accurate information about the timeline of events, my symptoms, and my observations about Patricia's behavior. David was more nervous about the prospect of answering questions that might implicate his mother in attempted murder. I keep thinking there has to be another explanation, he admitted as we prepared for bed. Maybe someone at the grocery store tampered with ingredients she bought. Maybe there was contamination at her supplier for the catering business. Maybe someone else entirely had access to the food. I appreciated his need to find alternatives to the obvious conclusion, but the evidence was pointing in a very specific direction. Patricia had served me a special portion of food that no one else ate. She had a history of monitoring my consumption with unusual intensity. She had access to my food, opportunity to tamper with it, and potential motivation related to her changing role in David's life. Most importantly, she had demonstrated knowledge and behavior patterns that suggested capability for this type of calculated harm. The months of gradual symptoms, the careful targeting, the immediate deflection to explanations about my health and stress levels, it all indicated someone with enough sophistication to plan and execute a long-term poisoning campaign. The security cameras I'd installed would capture any future attempts, but they wouldn't provide evidence about what had already happened. For that, I would need to rely on Detective Martinez's investigation and hope that Patricia had left traces of evidence that could be discovered and documented. As I lay in bed that night, listening to David's restless sleep beside me, I realized that our marriage was being tested in ways I'd never anticipated. The woman who had raised him, who had been his primary source of love and stability for most of his life, was very likely the same person who had tried to kill his wife. The cognitive dissonance of that reality was tearing him apart, and I could see it in every expression of doubt, every desperate search for alternative explanations. But I couldn't prioritize protecting David's relationship with his mother over protecting my own life. If Patricia was willing to escalate from emotional manipulation to physical harm, there was no reason to believe she would stop at one attempt. The next dose might be calculated to cause permanent damage or death, especially if she felt cornered by the police investigation. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but chilling: "Stop causing problems for this family. Some things are better left alone." I showed the message to David, who immediately called Detective Martinez to report what appeared to be a threat related to the investigation. The detective instructed us to save the message and forward it to the police department's cybercrime unit, who could potentially trace its origin. But the message had accomplished its intended purpose. Someone knew that I was actively pursuing the truth about what had happened to me, and they wanted me to stop. The implication was clear: back off or face consequences. Instead, the threat only strengthened my resolve. Whoever had sent that message had just provided additional evidence of criminal intent, and they had confirmed that my investigation was headed in the right direction. Part 4. Detective Martinez's office at the Maple Grove Police Department felt like neutral territory, a place where facts mattered more than family loyalty or social politeness. I sat across from her desk at 2 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, a folder of my own documentation spread between us, while she reviewed the official case file that had grown considerably since my hospitalization. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to walk me through your relationship with Patricia Williams from the beginning," Detective Martinez said, her pen poised over a legal pad. "Start with how you first met and take me through any significant interactions or incidents." I'd practiced this narrative dozens of times in my head, organizing events chronologically and focusing on observable facts rather than interpretations or emotions. The detective listened without interruption as I described the early months of dating David, the engagement period when Patricia had seemed genuinely welcoming, and the gradual shift in dynamics after our wedding. When I reached the pattern of Sunday dinner illnesses, Detective Martinez stopped taking notes and looked up. "You said these symptoms only occurred after meals at Patricia's house. Did you ever mention this pattern to your husband or to Patricia herself?" I mentioned it to David several times, but we both assumed it was stress or food sensitivity issues. I never directly confronted Patricia about it because I didn't want to seem accusatory or ungrateful. I was trying to maintain a good relationship with my mother-in-law. "And Patricia never suggested that you stop coming to Sunday dinners if the food was making you sick?" The question highlighted something I hadn't fully considered before. Any rational person, if they believed their cooking was causing someone distress, would suggest modifications or alternatives. Patricia had done the opposite, increasing her focus on my eating habits and expressing concern when I didn't finish everything on my plate. "No, she never suggested I skip dinners. If anything, she seemed more insistent that I eat larger portions. She would make comments about me looking thin or not taking care of myself properly. Detective Martinez made several notes. Tell me about the night you were hospitalized. Walk me through every detail you can remember about the food preparation and serving process. I described Patricia's insistence on serving me personally, the special corner portion with extra cheese, and the way she'd watched me eat with unusual intensity. I mentioned the delayed onset of symptoms and the severity compared to previous incidents. The hospital records show that the ricin concentration in your blood was significant but not immediately lethal, the detective said. That suggests someone with knowledge of dosing and effects. Has Patricia ever mentioned interests in botany, herbal remedies, or alternative medicine? Actually, she had. Patricia often talked about natural remedies she'd researched online, herbal teas she recommended for various ailments, and her vegetable garden where she grew what she called medicinal plants, alongside regular produce. She'd even given me homemade tinctures for headaches and digestive issues, which I'd accepted gratefully but never actually used. She's mentioned growing her own herbs and making natural remedies. She has a large garden behind her house, and she's always talking about the health benefits of different plants. Detective Martinez leaned forward. Did she ever give you any of these homemade remedies? Yes, several times. Tinctures and teas usually. I still have them at home if you think they might be relevant. We'll want to test those. Don't use them, and don't dispose of them. We'll collect them as potential evidence. The interview continued for another hour, covering Patricia's access to my food, her knowledge of my schedule and routine, and any conflicts or tensions that might have motivated harmful behavior. When Detective Martinez asked about potential triggers for escalation, I mentioned David's and my recent conversations about starting a family. You think Patricia might have viewed a potential pregnancy as threatening to her relationship with her son? I think Patricia has built her entire identity around being David's primary relationship, first as a single mother raising him after his father's death, and then as the central female figure in his adult life. Adding a wife was already challenging for her. Adding children, especially my children, might have felt like being completely replaced. Detective Martinez nodded. We see this sometimes in family poisoning cases. The perpetrator isn't necessarily trying to kill the victim immediately. They're trying to make the victim sick enough to be dependent, weak, or to leave the family situation voluntarily. That interpretation made horrifying sense. If Patricia could make me chronically ill, I might become too sick to challenge her position as the most important woman in David's life. If my health problems seemed ongoing and mysterious, David might start to see me as a burden rather than a partner. And if I became frustrated enough with constant illness, I might choose to leave the marriage rather than continue suffering. The ricin dosing supports this theory, Detective Martinez continued. It was enough to cause serious symptoms and potentially long-term health problems, but calibrated to avoid immediate death that would trigger an obvious murder investigation. After my interview concluded, I drove home with a mixture of validation and dread. The detective's questions had confirmed that my suspicions were reasonable and evidence-based, but they'd also highlighted how calculated and sophisticated Patricia's campaign against me had been. This wasn't emotional outbursts or impulsive behavior. It was systematic psychological and physical abuse designed to slowly destroy my health and my marriage. David was waiting for me when I arrived at our apartment, pacing the living room with nervous energy. His own interview was scheduled for later that afternoon, and the strain of potentially implicating his mother in attempted murder was written across his face. How did it go? He asked, though his expression suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Detective Martinez is thorough and professional. She asked a lot of questions about Patricia's behavior patterns and access to my food. The evidence is pointing in a pretty clear direction, David. He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. I keep thinking about all the times Mom brought you special teas when you weren't feeling well, all the times she insisted you eat more because you looked tired or stressed. If she was actually making you sick, then every gesture of care was really an attack. The realization was devastating for someone who had built his worldview around his mother's unconditional love and sacrifice. David was having to reconstruct not just recent events, but decades of memories and assumptions about the woman who had shaped his entire understanding of family and loyalty. I know this is incredibly difficult, I said gently, but we need to focus on finding the truth and keeping everyone safe. Detective Martinez said they're going to search Patricia's house tomorrow with a warrant. If she's innocent, they won't find anything incriminating. If she's guilty, the evidence will speak for itself. David's interview lasted 3 hours, during which time I remained at home monitoring the security cameras I'd installed. The devices had been recording for several days now, capturing our daily routines and any visitors to the apartment. So far, the footage showed only normal activities: David and me cooking dinner, watching television, getting ready for work. But the cameras were also documenting our conversations about the investigation, creating a record of how the situation was affecting our relationship and mental state. Around 6 o'clock, my phone rang with a call from an unknown local number. I answered cautiously, remembering the threatening text message from earlier in the week. "Emma, this is Michael Williams, David's brother. I just heard about what the police think happened to you, and I wanted to reach out directly." Michael's voice carried the same shock and disbelief I'd heard from David, but there was something else underneath it, a careful quality that made me pay closer attention to his words. "Emma, I know this situation is incredibly difficult for everyone involved. Susan and I have been talking, and we're wondering if there might be some kind of misunderstanding here. Mom's been under a lot of stress lately with the catering business expanding, and sometimes when people are overwhelmed, accidents can happen in the kitchen." The conversation felt scripted, as if Michael had rehearsed these exact phrases before calling. I wondered if Patricia had reached out to her older son, coaching him on how to approach me, or what points to emphasize in defense of her innocence. "Michael, the hospital found ricin in my bloodstream. That's not something that happens by accident during normal food preparation." There was a long pause. "Ricin, are you sure that's what they said? Because that sounds incredibly serious, like something from a spy movie rather than a family dinner mishap." His surprise seemed genuine enough, but I'd learned not to trust my ability to read people's intentions over the phone. Everyone in David's family was skilled at presenting the face they wanted others to see, and I'd been fooled by that talent for months. "It is serious, Michael. Someone deliberately put a poison in my food that could have killed me. The police are treating this as an attempted murder investigation." "Jesus, Emma, I had no idea it was that severe. David just said you'd gotten sick after Sunday dinner, and that the police were asking questions. If someone really tried to poison you, then obviously they need to find out who did it, and prosecute them to the full extent of the law." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Michael expressing shock and concern, while subtly probing for information about what the police had discovered, and what evidence they might have collected. His questions were casual enough to seem like natural curiosity, but their focus suggested he was gathering intelligence, rather than simply offering family support. After I ended the call, I immediately phoned Detective Martinez to report the conversation. The detective listened carefully as I described Michael's questions and his apparent surprise about the ricin findings. "It's interesting that he claimed David only told him you'd gotten sick, without mentioning the poison aspect," Detective Martinez said. "We interviewed your husband for 3 hours this afternoon, and he was very forthcoming about the severity of the situation and the specific substance involved." That discrepancy suggested either Michael was lying about what David had told him, or someone else had given him incomplete information designed to make his surprise seem more believable. Both necessary and deeply sad. The fact that I couldn't trust food prepared by anyone in David's family represented a fundamental shift in how we would navigate future relationships. The security cameras continued their silent documentation of our activities, creating a digital record of two people trying to maintain normalcy while their world shifted around them. I found myself glancing at the devices periodically, remembering that everything we said and did was being preserved as potential evidence. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number that had sent the previous threat. This message was more direct. "Last warning. Drop the charges or face the consequences." I showed the message to David immediately, and he called Detective Martinez to report the second threat. The detective instructed us to save the message and informed us that the cybercrime unit was close to identifying the sender based on digital footprints from the first text. Mrs. Williams, these threats actually help our case by demonstrating consciousness of guilt and ongoing criminal behavior. Someone is clearly worried about what our investigation might uncover. The threats also meant that someone was monitoring the progress of the police investigation closely enough to know that charges were likely forthcoming. That level of inside information suggested either contact with law enforcement personnel or communication with Patricia about what she'd learned during her interview. I slept fitfully that night, waking periodically to check the security camera feeds on my phone. The apartment remained secure, but my hypervigilance was a reminder of how fundamentally the poisoning had altered my sense of safety and trust. The next morning, Detective Martinez called at 7:30 to inform us that the search warrant was being executed at Patricia's house. The search team included officers trained in hazardous materials detection, given the possibility that they might encounter ricin or the equipment used to produce it. We'll contact you as soon as the search is complete. In the meantime, I recommend that you and your husband stay somewhere public and visible. Don't go to work, don't follow your normal routines, and don't visit any family members until we know more about what we're dealing with. The warning was ominous. If Detective Martinez was concerned about our safety during the search, it suggested she expected to find evidence that would provoke strong reactions from Patricia or other family members. David and I spent the morning at the Maple Grove Public Library, a neutral location with security cameras and plenty of witnesses. We brought our laptops and tried to work on ordinary tasks, but concentration was impossible. Every phone notification made us both jump, and every new person entering the library drew our nervous attention. At 11:15, Detective Martinez called with preliminary results from the search. Her voice was grim but satisfied. We found a fully equipped laboratory in Patricia's basement, including equipment for extracting and concentrating plant-based compounds. We also found approximately 2 ounces of processed ricin powder, packaging materials consistent with the substance found in your bloodstream, and detailed notes about dosing and effects. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Patricia hadn't just poisoned me once, she'd established a systematic operation for producing the means to poison me repeatedly. The laboratory setup indicated premeditation and sophistication that went far beyond a single impulsive act. We also found what appears to be a journal documenting her observations of your reactions to different doses administered over several months. She was essentially conducting human experimentation, tracking your symptoms and adjusting her methods based on the results. The clinical nature of Patricia's approach was perhaps the most chilling aspect of Detective Martinez's report. She hadn't poisoned me in a moment of anger or jealousy. She'd developed a methodical system for gradually destroying my health while carefully documenting the process. Mrs. Williams, we're issuing an arrest warrant for Patricia Williams on charges of attempted murder, aggravated assault, and possession of illegal substances. We expect to take her into custody within the next few hours. The moment I'd been building toward for weeks had finally arrived. Patricia would be arrested, charged, and held accountable for what she'd done to me. But instead of feeling victorious or relieved, I felt hollow and exhausted. The confirmation of her guilt meant that everything I'd suspected about her was true, and that David's relationship with his mother was irreparably destroyed. Detective Martinez, what about the threatening text messages? Were you able to trace those? The messages came from a prepaid phone registered to Michael Williams. We'll be questioning him about his involvement and potential conspiracy charges. So Michael had known about his mother's activities, at least enough to try intimidating me into dropping the investigation. His phone call the previous evening hadn't been an attempt to understand what was happening, it had been reconnaissance to determine how much evidence the police had gathered. David's face went ashen as he processed what Detective Martinez had told us. His mother was going to be arrested for attempting to murder his wife, and his brother was implicated in trying to cover up the crime. The family he'd trusted completely had betrayed both of us in the most fundamental way possible. What happens now? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Now we build the strongest possible case to ensure that Mrs. Patricia Williams faces appropriate consequences for her actions. The evidence we've collected today should be sufficient for conviction, but we'll continue investigating to determine the full scope of her activities and any other potential victims. Other potential victims. The phrase sent a chill through me as I realized that Patricia's systematic approach to poisoning suggested experience and practice. I might not have been her first target, just the first one to survive long enough for the truth to be discovered. After Detective Martinez ended the call, David and I sat in silence among the library stacks, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of people pursuing normal activities. The contrast between their mundane concerns and our catastrophic reality felt surreal. "I need to call Michael," David said finally. "I need to hear from him directly whether he knew what Mom was doing." "David," Detective Martinez said, "he sent the threatening texts. That means he knew enough about the situation to try scaring me away from pursuing it. He's not an innocent bystander in this." David's expression crumbled. "Alfred twised wang ford if his innocent fardikan and forden emma forden. My whole family, my mother tried to kill you and my brother tried to help her cover it up. How do I come back from something like that?" The question hung between us like a challenge to our future together. Patricia's actions had poisoned more than my food. They'd poisoned David's ability to trust his own judgment about the people closest to him. Recovery would require rebuilding not just my physical health, but our emotional foundation and his faith in family relationships. "We come back from it by focusing on the family we're building together," I said, reaching for his hand. "Patricia made her choices and Michael made his. Those choices don't define us or determine our future." But even as I spoke the words, I knew that healing from this betrayal would take years rather than months. The security cameras I'd installed would need to remain in place indefinitely. The careful scrutiny I now applied to food and relationships would become a permanent part of how I navigated the world. And David would need extensive therapy to process the trauma of discovering that his mother had tried to murder his wife. The afternoon brought news of Patricia's arrest at her home, where she was taken into custody without resistance. According to Detective Martinez, Patricia had maintained her innocence even when confronted with the laboratory equipment and ricin supplies found in her basement. Michael was arrested an hour later at his workplace on charges of intimidation and obstruction of justice related to the threatening messages. Susan, apparently unaware of her husband's involvement, was cooperating with police to provide information about any suspicious conversations or behaviors she might have witnessed. By evening, the story had reached local news outlets. The headline, "Local Woman Arrested for Poisoning Daughter-in-Law," appeared on television screens and newspaper websites throughout Maple Grove. Patricia's catering business, which had relied on community trust and reputation, would be destroyed even if she were eventually acquitted. David's phone buzzed constantly with calls from friends, co-workers, and extended family members who had seen the news coverage. Some offered support and expressed shock. Others seemed to be calling for gossip or drama rather than genuine concern. We turned off both our phones after the 15th call and decided to spend the night in a hotel rather than returning to our apartment. The hotel room felt safer than our own home, despite the security cameras I'd installed there. Distance from familiar surroundings helped create psychological space to process what had happened without the constant reminders of our normal life routines. "I keep thinking about all the Sunday dinners," David said as we sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the muted television. "Every time Mom served you personally, every time she insisted you eat more, every time she watched you so carefully. She was monitoring the effects of what she was doing to you." The realization was brutal but necessary. Patricia's maternal behavior during family meals had been performative, designed to maintain her cover while she systematically destroyed my health. Her expressions of concern about my appetite and energy levels had been genuine, but not because she cared about my well-being. She'd been concerned about whether her dosing was achieving the desired effects. "David, I need you to understand that none of this is your fault. You couldn't have known what she was doing because it was so far outside the realm of normal human behavior. Even I didn't fully recognize it until I was hospitalized." He nodded, but I could see the self-blame in his eyes. David would struggle with guilt about not protecting me, not recognizing the signs, not questioning his mother's behavior more aggressively. Recovery would require him to forgive himself for trusting someone who had spent decades earning that trust through deceptive means. The hotel room's silence felt heavy with unspoken fears about our future. We'd survived Patricia's attempt to destroy our marriage through poisoning, but we still faced the challenge of rebuilding trust and intimacy after such a fundamental violation of safety. The security cameras, the hypervigilance, the careful scrutiny of food and relationships, all of these protective measures would need to be balanced against our desire to create a normal, loving partnership. As I lay in the unfamiliar hotel bed that night, listening to David's restless sleep beside me, I realized that Patricia's greatest failure hadn't been in her execution of the poisoning plan. It had been in underestimating my determination to fight back. She'd expected me to become weak, dependent, and eventually driven away by constant illness. Instead, I'd become stronger, more analytical, and more committed to exposing the truth. Tomorrow would bring court appearances, media attention, and the beginning of a legal process that could take months or years to resolve completely. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt safe. Patricia was in custody where she couldn't harm me. Michael was facing consequences for his attempts at intimidation, and the evidence was overwhelming enough to ensure that justice would be served. The security cameras I'd installed would continue recording, documenting our recovery process and our gradual return to normal life. But they would also serve as a reminder that sometimes the greatest threats come from the people we trust most, and that protecting yourself requires constant vigilance even within family relationships. Patricia Williams had tried to poison me slowly and systematically, expecting that I would never discover the truth or fight back effectively. She'd underestimated both my intelligence and my determination to survive. Now she would spend years in prison, and I would spend those same years rebuilding the life she'd tried to destroy. Final part: the courthouse steps felt like solid ground under my feet for the first time in 8 months. Patricia Williams had just been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for attempted murder, conspiracy, and possession of illegal substances. Michael received 18 months for obstruction of justice and criminal intimidation. The gavel had fallen with a sound that echoed through the packed courtroom, and now it was over. David stood beside me, his hand tight in mine, watching as reporters approached with cameras and microphones extended toward us. We'd agreed beforehand to make a brief statement and then disappear from public view as quickly as possible. The media attention had been intense throughout the trial, with headlines about family betrayal and poisoning plots dominating local news for weeks. "Mrs. Williams, how do you feel about the sentence?" a reporter called out, her voice cutting through the crowd noise. I'd practiced this moment, knowing that my words would be recorded and replayed, potentially seen by other victims of family abuse who might be struggling with their own situations. Justice has been served today, not just for me, but for anyone who has ever been systematically abused by someone they trusted. The evidence was overwhelming, and the sentence reflects the serious nature of these crimes. My husband and I are grateful for the thorough investigation by Detective Martinez and the Maple Grove Police Department, and for the professionalism of the prosecutor's office throughout this process. David stepped forward to add his own statement. "My mother's actions do not represent the values I was raised with or the kind of family we intend to build together. We hope that our experience can serve as a reminder that abuse can come from unexpected sources, and that victims should always trust their instincts and seek help when something feels wrong." The questions continued, but we'd said what we came to say. David's security firm had hired a private investigator to help us navigate media attention and ensure our safety as we transitioned back to normal life. The investigator, a former FBI agent named Sarah Chen, had become invaluable in helping us understand how to protect ourselves while still engaging with necessary legal processes. We slipped away from the courthouse through a side exit, where Sarah was waiting with a rental car to drive us home. The familiar streets of Maple Grove looked different now, not because anything had physically changed, but because my relationship with the community had been fundamentally altered by months of public scrutiny and court proceedings. "How are you holding up?" Sarah asked as we drove through downtown, past the library where David and I had waited for news of Patricia's arrest all those months ago. Better than expected, I answered honestly. There's something powerful about hearing a judge officially validate what you experienced. For so long I questioned whether I was overreacting or misinterpreting Patricia's behavior. Having a federal court conclude that she systematically tried to murder me removes any lingering doubt about whether I was justified in fighting back. David had been quieter since the sentencing, processing what it meant to have his mother officially designated as a convicted felon who would spend the next 12 years in federal prison. The courtroom had been filled with character witnesses who testified about Patricia's contributions to the community through her catering business and volunteer work. Hearing people describe his mother as generous and caring while knowing what she'd done to me had created cognitive dissonance that therapy was helping him work through. The victim impact statement you read was incredibly powerful, Sarah continued. I think it helped the judge understand not just the physical harm, but the psychological damage that this kind of systematic abuse creates. Writing that statement had taken weeks of careful thought and multiple revisions with input from the prosecutor's office. I'd wanted to convey the full scope of what Patricia had done without sounding vindictive or emotional in a way that might undermine my credibility. The challenge was describing months of gaslighting, manipulation, and gradual poisoning in language that captured both the calculated nature of her actions and the devastating impact on my health and sense of reality. The victim impact statement had also given me an opportunity to address the broader implications of Patricia's crimes. During the trial, her defense attorney had argued that she was a grieving mother who had difficulty accepting her son's marriage and that her actions, while misguided, stemmed from love rather than malice. I'd used my statement to explain why that interpretation was both factually incorrect and dangerous to other potential victims. Patricia Williams didn't poison me because she loved her son too much, I'd told the judge during sentencing. She poisoned me because she viewed me as property that threatened her control over someone she considered to belong to her. Her actions weren't emotional outbursts or mistakes made in the heat of passion. They were calculated, systematic, and designed to cause maximum suffering while maintaining plausible deniability. This wasn't love, this was possession, control, and ultimately attempted murder when other forms of manipulation failed to achieve her desired results. The statement had taken 20 minutes to read aloud, detailing everything from the initial symptoms I'd dismissed as stress to the months of recovery and hypervigilance that followed my hospitalization. I'd described the security cameras I'd installed in my own home, the careful scrutiny I now applied to all food preparation, and the ongoing therapy required to rebuild trust in family relationships. Most importantly, I'd addressed the defense's suggestion that Patricia deserved leniency because of her age and previous community contributions. The defendant's ability to maintain a positive public image while systematically poisoning her daughter-in-law demonstrates sophistication and premeditation that makes her more dangerous, not less. Someone capable of such elaborate deception and long-term planning poses an ongoing threat to anyone who might interfere with her sense of control and ownership over family members. The judge had clearly been influenced by both the overwhelming physical evidence and the psychological profile that emerged during testimony. Patricia's basement laboratory had contained not just ration production equipment but detailed notes documenting her observations of my reactions to different doses administered over 8 months. The prosecution had argued convincingly that this represented one of the most systematic and calculating cases of domestic poisoning in state history. During the trial, additional evidence had emerged that painted an even more disturbing picture of Patricia's mindset and capabilities. Forensic analysis of her computer revealed extensive research into various plant-based toxins, their effects on human physiology, and methods for gradual administration that would avoid detection. She'd visited online forums dedicated to natural medicine and herbal remedies, but her search history showed specific interest in compounds that could cause illness rather than promote health. Even more chilling was the discovery of what appeared to be practice runs on other targets. Investigators found evidence that Patricia had been experimenting with low-level doses of various substances on family, friends, and catering clients, apparently testing delivery methods and observing reactions. While none of these earlier victims had been harmed seriously enough to seek medical attention, the pattern suggested that I hadn't been her first target, just her most sustained and systematic one. The revelation that Patricia had essentially been conducting human experiments for years before escalating to attempted murder had influenced both the charges filed against her and the sentence imposed. The judge had noted during sentencing that the defendant's actions showed a callous disregard for human life and a level of premeditation that represents a clear danger to society. Michael's sentencing had been more straightforward. His involvement in sending threatening messages and attempting to intimidate me into dropping the investigation had been proven through digital forensics and phone records. During his own victim impact statement, he'd claimed that he was only trying to protect his mother and that he hadn't understood the full extent of her actions. But prosecutors had presented evidence that Michael had known about at least some of Patricia's activities, including her interest in plant-based compounds and her unusual focus on my health and eating habits. Text messages between the two of them revealed conversations about handling the Emma situation and making sure she doesn't cause more problems for the family. The most damaging evidence against Michael had been a recorded phone conversation with Patricia from her jail cell in which she'd explicitly discussed her poisoning activities and asked him to dispose of remaining evidence from her house. The conversation had been recorded as part of standard jail monitoring procedures, and Michael's agreement to help cover up her crimes had sealed his fate. Now, driving through Maple Grove toward the apartment David and I had been slowly reclaiming as our own, I felt a strange mixture of closure and anticipation. The legal proceedings were complete, justice had been served, and the immediate threat to our safety had been eliminated. But the work of rebuilding our lives and relationships was just beginning. The security cameras I'd installed 8 months earlier were still in place and would likely remain so indefinitely. The hypervigilance I'd developed around food preparation and social situations had become a permanent part of my psychological landscape. And David's relationship with family gatherings and holiday traditions had been forever altered by the knowledge that his mother had used these occasions to systematically poison his wife. But we'd also discovered strengths and resilience we hadn't known we possessed. David's willingness to cooperate with the investigation, even when it meant providing evidence against his own mother, had demonstrated a commitment to truth and justice that had deepened my respect for him. My own ability to recognize patterns, gather evidence, and fight back against someone who had seemed untouchable had revealed capabilities I'd never needed to develop before. The apartment felt different as we walked through the door for the first time as fully vindicated survivors rather than ongoing victims. The familiar rooms looked the same, but our relationship to the space had been transformed by everything we'd endured and overcome together. "I want to cook dinner tonight," I announced, surprising both David and myself. "Something elaborate and time-consuming. Something that celebrates being alive and being able to eat food I've prepared myself." David smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him in weeks. "What did you have in mind?" "Homemade pasta with marinara sauce from scratch. Garlic bread from fresh ingredients. Maybe even a chocolate cake for dessert. I want to fill this apartment with the smell of food that's safe and delicious and made with love instead of malice." We spent the afternoon shopping for ingredients, comparing prices, and reading labels with the careful attention of people who would never again take food safety for granted.
Differently. That was perhaps the most crucial element of my survival, having a partner who believed me and supported my need to gather evidence rather than prioritizing family peace over my safety. Many victims of systematic poisoning might not have that advantage, especially if the perpetrator had successfully isolated them or convinced other family members that the victim was mentally unstable. The guide would need to address those complications, providing strategies for building support systems and documenting evidence even when family members were resistant or actively opposed to investigation. It would also need to emphasize the importance of professional help from both medical providers and law enforcement who had experience with these types of cases. As I wrote, I realized that Patricia's greatest tactical error hadn't been in her choice of poison or her laboratory setup. It had been in underestimating my willingness to fight back and my ability to think strategically about evidence gathering. She'd assumed that I would either suffer in silence or be dismissed as a hysterical wife with stress-related health problems. Instead, I'd approached the situation like the teacher I was, gathering data, identifying patterns, and building a case based on observable facts rather than emotional interpretations. The security cameras had been crucial, but equally important was my decision to document everything in writing, to seek medical attention promptly, and to cooperate fully with law enforcement rather than trying to handle the situation privately. The guide I was writing would emphasize these strategic elements while acknowledging the emotional and psychological challenges of suspecting that someone you're supposed to trust is deliberately harming you. It would provide practical checklists and decision trees to help victims determine when suspicion was justified and when professional intervention was necessary. Over the following weeks, as appeals deadlines passed and media attention gradually shifted to other stories, David and I settled into new routines that incorporated the lessons we'd learned about safety and vigilance without allowing fear to dominate our daily lives. The security cameras remained active, but we'd stopped checking them obsessively. We prepared our own food and ate at restaurants we trusted, but we'd begun entertaining friends and enjoying social meals again. Most importantly, we'd begun talking seriously about the future we wanted to build together. The poisoning ordeal had tested our relationship in extreme ways, but it had also revealed our compatibility as partners who could face crisis with mutual support and shared commitment to truth over convenience. "I think we're ready to start trying for children," I told David one evening as we walked through the state park where we'd hiked on that last normal weekend before everything changed. He stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "Are you sure? After everything Patricia did, after the way she tried to prevent us from having the family we wanted? Especially after everything she did, she tried to destroy our future because she couldn't accept that your life was moving forward. I'm not going to let her win by allowing fear to prevent us from building the family we've always wanted." The decision felt like the final step in reclaiming our lives from Patricia's destructive influence. She'd tried to make me too sick to have children, too weak to challenge her position as the primary woman in David's life. Creating new life together was the ultimate rejection of her attempts to control our future. 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, I received a letter from her in prison. The return address was unmistakable, and I debated for several days whether to open it or simply dispose of it unopened. Finally, curiosity won, and I read what would be the last communication between us. The letter was brief and carefully worded, probably reviewed by prison officials and possibly her attorney. Patricia wrote that she hoped I was recovering well from my illness and that she looked forward to rebuilding family relationships when her legal situation was resolved. She expressed regret about the misunderstandings that had led to our current circumstances and hoped that time would heal the divisions that had developed between us. There was no admission of guilt, no acknowledgement of what she had actually done, no recognition of the systematic nature of her crimes. Even facing 12 years in federal prison, Patricia was still maintaining the fiction that she was the victim of misunderstandings rather than the perpetrator of attempted murder. I showed the letter to David, who read it with disgust and anger. "She's still not taking responsibility. She's still pretending this was all some kind of accident or miscommunication." "I'm not surprised," I replied, filing the letter in the folder of documents related to her case. People who are capable of systematic poisoning don't typically develop sudden insights into their own behavior. She's probably convinced herself that she was justified in everything she did. The letter served as a reminder that Patricia remained dangerous, not just to me but potentially to other inmates, prison staff, or anyone else who might interfere with her sense of control and entitlement. I forwarded a copy to Detective Martinez and to the federal prosecutor who had handled her case, in case it revealed information relevant to her ongoing incarceration or future parole considerations. 2 years after Patricia's arrest, David and I moved to Portland, Oregon, where he'd accepted a position with a technology company that specialized in cybersecurity. The irony of his career path wasn't lost on either of us. After experiencing such a profound violation of safety and trust, he'd chosen to make protection and security his professional focus. I found work teaching at a private school that served students from complicated family backgrounds, many of whom had experienced various forms of abuse or neglect. My own experience with systematic family abuse had given me insights into the psychological patterns and survival strategies that these students employed, and I was able to connect with them in ways that felt meaningful and productive. Our new apartment in Portland had state-of-the-art security systems, but more importantly, it had no history of trauma or violation. The rooms smelled like fresh paint and new furniture rather than fear and hypervigilance. We cooked elaborate meals together, invited friends over for dinner parties, and gradually rebuilt our relationship with food and hospitality as expressions of love rather than potential weapons. On the third anniversary of my hospitalization, I published the guide I'd been writing about recognizing and documenting systematic family abuse. The booklet was distributed through domestic violence organizations, medical providers, and law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest. The response was overwhelming, with dozens of readers reaching out to share their own stories of suspected poisoning, gaslighting, and other forms of hidden abuse from trusted family members. Several of these readers had used the strategies I'd outlined to gather evidence that led to successful prosecutions of their abusers. Others had used the information to protect themselves and their children by leaving dangerous situations or establishing safety measures that prevented escalation to physical harm. The guide had become more than a personal therapeutic project. It had become a tool that was helping other people survive situations similar to what I'd experienced. Patricia's attempt to destroy my life had been transformed into a resource that was protecting and empowering other victims of family abuse. On a sunny Saturday morning in Portland, exactly 4 years after Patricia had first tried to poison me, David and I welcomed our daughter Emma Rose into the world. She was healthy, beautiful, and completely unaware that her existence represented the ultimate victory over someone who had tried to prevent her parents from building the family they'd dreamed of creating together. Holding my daughter in the hospital room, surrounded by flowers from friends and colleagues who had supported us through our recovery, I thought about all the ways that Patricia's plan had backfired. She'd wanted to make me too sick to challenge her position in David's life. Instead, I'd become stronger, more analytical, and more determined to protect the people I loved. She'd wanted to drive a wedge between David and me. Instead, we'd developed a partnership based on mutual support through crisis and shared commitment to truth over comfortable illusions. Most significantly, she'd wanted to prevent us from having children who would reduce her importance in David's life. Instead, her actions had delayed but not prevented our family plans, and our daughter would grow up in a home where truth, evidence, and personal safety were prioritized over maintaining peace with dangerous people. Patricia Williams had taught me that the people we trust most can sometimes be the people who pose the greatest threats to our safety and well-being. But she'd also taught me that intelligence, persistence, and careful documentation could overcome even the most sophisticated attempts at hidden abuse. As I looked at my daughter's face, I made a silent promise that she would grow up knowing how to recognize manipulation, how to trust her own instincts, and how to seek help when something felt wrong. She would never have to learn these lessons the way I had, through hospitalization and criminal trials and years of recovery. The security cameras that had saved my life were still recording, documenting our transformation from victims to survivors, to parents building the future that someone else had tried to destroy. Patricia Williams was serving her sentence in federal prison, and my daughter was sleeping peacefully in my arms. Justice had been served, truth had prevailed, and life had not just continued but flourished despite someone's best efforts to end it. That was a legacy worth fighting for, and a story worth sharing with anyone who might need to know that survival is possible, even when the threat comes from the people who are supposed to love you most. 5 years have passed since I last set foot in Maple Grove, Wisconsin. The small suburban town where I nearly lost my life to systematic poisoning feels like a different world now, a place that exists only in court documents and therapy sessions, where I continue to process the psychological aftermath of Patricia Williams' attempt to murder me. Today I'm returning not as a victim seeking justice, but as someone who has transformed their trauma into purpose and power. The invitation came through my literary agent 6 months ago. The Maple Grove Community Center wanted me to speak at their annual domestic violence awareness event, specifically about recognizing hidden forms of family abuse. My guide for systematic poisoning victims had evolved into a best-selling book titled Silent Weapons: Recognizing and Surviving Family Abuse, and speaking requests now came from across the country. David initially opposed the idea of returning to the place where our ordeal began. "Why put yourself through that emotional stress?" he'd asked, holding our 2-year-old daughter Emma Rose while she babbled happily in his arms. "We've built a good life in Portland, we don't need to revisit that chapter just to help people who could read your book instead." But something about the invitation felt like completing a circle that had been left open. The community center sat just 3 blocks from Patricia's former house, the one where she'd maintained her basement laboratory for producing ricin, while operating a catering business that fed dozens of local families. The irony of speaking about family safety in the shadow of where such profound betrayal had occurred felt both poetic and necessary. Emma Rose was staying with David's cousin in Portland for the weekend, the first time we'd left her with extended family since her birth. Building trust with David's relatives had been a gradual process, complicated by the knowledge that his own mother had tried to kill me and his brother had assisted in covering it up. Every family gathering required careful navigation of conversations about Patricia, who had become the relative no one mentioned but everyone thought about. The drive from Portland to Maple Grove took us through familiar landscapes that triggered memories I'd spent years learning to manage. The rolling hills of eastern Oregon gave way to the flat farmlands of the Midwest, and with each mile marker I felt my hypervigilance returning. Old habits of scanning environments for potential threats, checking exits, and monitoring the people around me for suspicious behavior emerged from the psychological toolkit I'd developed during the investigation and trial. "You're doing that thing with your hands again," David observed as we passed the Wisconsin state line. I looked down to see my fingers drumming against my thigh in the pattern I'd developed during particularly stressful court sessions, a nervous habit that appeared whenever I felt emotionally unsafe. "I know, I'm working on it. Being back here is bringing up more emotional reactions than I expected." David reached across the center console to squeeze my hand. "We can turn around right now if this feels like too much. The speaking engagement isn't worth compromising your mental health." But I wasn't the same woman who had fled Maple Grove 5 years earlier, terrified and traumatized by the betrayal of someone I'd trusted completely. The woman returning had written a book that was helping abuse victims nationwide. She'd testified before congressional committees about gaps in domestic violence legislation. She'd built a nonprofit organization that provided resources for people experiencing systematic family abuse. Most importantly, she'd learned that healing required not just surviving trauma, but transforming it into something that served a larger purpose. The hotel where we stayed was new construction, built on the site of what used to be a small shopping center where I'd bought the security cameras that ultimately saved my life. The symbolism wasn't lost on me as we checked in under the name that had become familiar to readers of my book, Emma Rodriguez Williams, victim turned advocate, survivor turned success story. That evening, David and I drove past our old apartment building on Oak Avenue. New tenants occupied the unit where I'd installed hidden cameras and spent sleepless nights documenting evidence of Patricia's crimes. The current residents had painted the front door bright yellow and planted flower boxes that created a cheerful appearance completely different from the fortress mentality with which we'd approached the space during our final months there. "Do you miss it?" David asked as we sat in the rental car, watching children play in the apartment complex courtyard. "I miss who we were before all this happened," I said honestly. "I miss the innocence of believing that family meant safety, that home-cooked meals were expressions of love rather than potential weapons. But I don't miss the person I was then, the one who ignored red flags because she wanted to belong somewhere so badly." The Emma Rodriguez, who had married David Williams, had been eager to please, quick to excuse concerning behavior, and desperate for the stability of belonging to a traditional family structure. The woman sitting in this rental car had learned that belonging to something toxic was worse than belonging to nothing at all, and that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones planning your destruction. We drove past Patricia's former house on Elm Street, now occupied by a young family with 2 small children whose toys scattered across the front yard. The basement where she'd operated her poison laboratory had presumably been converted back to normal use, though I wondered if the new owners knew the history of what had taken place in the space where their children might now play. The realtor probably didn't mention the attempted murder lab in the property disclosure, David said grimly, echoing my thoughts. "Maybe that's for the best. Everyone deserves the chance to make new memories in a space, to transform it from something dark into something healthy." The same principle applied to our own relationship and family life. Patricia's actions had cast a shadow over our early marriage, but Emma Rose's birth had transformed that darkness into determination to create the safe, loving family environment that Patricia had tried to prevent. Our daughter would grow up knowing that her parents had survived something terrible and emerged stronger, that they had chosen truth over comfort and justice over family peace. The community center event was scheduled for Saturday evening, giving us a full day to reconnect with the few people in Maple Grove who had supported us during the crisis. Detective Martinez, now retired from the police force, met us for lunch at a new restaurant downtown. She looked relaxed and happy, the stress lines that had marked her face during the intensive investigation smoothed by retirement and the satisfaction of having solved one of the most complex family abuse cases in state history. "I still get calls about your case," she told me over soup and sandwiches. Other investigators dealing with suspected systematic poisoning cases, prosecutors who need guidance on evidence collection, even family members who recognize similar patterns in their own situations. Your willingness to fight back and document everything created a template that's helping people nationwide. The conversation inevitably turned to Patricia's current situation. She was serving her sentence at a federal facility in Ohio, where she'd apparently become a model prisoner who helped in the kitchen and participated in various rehabilitation programs. According to Detective Martinez's contacts in the federal system, Patricia maintained her innocence and regularly filed appeals claiming that she'd been wrongfully convicted based on circumstantial evidence. Does she ever ask about Emma or David? I found myself curious despite my best efforts to avoid thinking about Patricia's current circumstances. Never, according to the prison staff I've spoken with. She talks about her case, her appeals, and her plans for when she's released, but she doesn't express remorse or ask about the people she harmed. It's as if you and David simply don't exist in her mental narrative. The information was disturbing but not surprising. People capable of systematic poisoning rarely developed genuine empathy for their victims. Patricia's ability to maintain her innocence narrative, even while serving time for attempted murder, demonstrated the same compartmentalization that had allowed her to cook family dinners while operating a poison laboratory in her basement. Michael had been released after serving his full 18-month sentence and had relocated to another state, apparently cutting all contact with David and the extended family. Susan had divorced him during his incarceration and now lived with their children in Minneapolis, where she'd built a new life that didn't include any reminders of the poisoning scandal. The family destruction was probably as much Patricia's goal as harming Emma directly, Detective Martinez observed. Controlling people often prefer to isolate their primary targets by destroying relationships with potential supporters. That evening, the community center auditorium was packed beyond capacity. The audience included domestic violence counselors, law enforcement personnel, medical providers, and dozens of community members who had followed the case in local media coverage. Many were people who had eaten Patricia's catering over the years, who had trusted her with their special occasions and family celebrations, only to learn that she'd been experimenting with plant-based toxins while preparing their food. My presentation began with the basics of recognizing systematic family abuse, focusing on the gradual escalation patterns that characterize most cases. I explained how abusers typically test boundaries with small violations before escalating to more serious harm, and how they use gaslighting and manipulation to make victims doubt their own perceptions of what's happening to them. The most dangerous abusers are often the most respected community members, I told the audience, seeing recognition in many faces. They understand that a positive public reputation provides cover for private abuse, and they're skilled at presenting themselves as caring, devoted family members while systematically harming the people closest to them. I described the specific warning signs of potential poisoning, the importance of documenting patterns rather than individual incidents, and the resources available for people who suspected they were being deliberately harmed by family members. Most importantly, I emphasized that victims should trust their instincts even when others dismissed their concerns as paranoia or stress. Patricia Williams was able to poison me for 8 months because I kept making excuses for her behavior instead of trusting my own observations, I explained. I wanted so badly to be part of a loving family that I ignored clear evidence that someone in that family was trying to hurt me. Don't make the same mistake. If something feels wrong, investigate. If you're getting sick in patterns that seem suspicious, document everything. If family members discourage you from seeking medical attention or asking questions, that's a red flag, not a reason to stay quiet. The question and answer session that followed was intense and emotional. Several audience members shared their own stories of suspected family abuse, and I was able to provide specific guidance about evidence collection, safety planning, and legal resources. A local physician asked about medical protocols for suspected poisoning cases, and I outlined the testing procedures and documentation methods that had been crucial in building the case against Patricia. One question came from a middle-aged woman who identified herself as someone who had hired Patricia's catering services for multiple events over the years. How do we know she wasn't experimenting on all of us? How do we know that her other customers weren't also victims? It was a question that had haunted me since learning about Patricia's basement laboratory and her apparent history of testing various compounds on unsuspecting targets. During the investigation, several of her former catering clients had reported unusual symptoms after events she'd catered, but none had sought medical attention or preserved evidence that could be tested. The investigation found evidence that Patricia had been experimenting with various compounds for years before escalating to sustained poisoning attempts. I answered carefully. If you experienced unusual symptoms after events she catered, I recommend discussing those incidents with your physician and reporting them to law enforcement, even though the passage of time makes evidence collection challenging. After the presentation ended, I was approached by dozens of people who wanted to share their own stories or ask more detailed questions about safety strategies and resource access. Many were domestic violence professionals who worked with clients experiencing various forms of family abuse, and they were eager to incorporate information about systematic poisoning into their training and awareness programs. The most impactful conversation was with a young woman named Sarah, who approached me during the reception that followed the presentation. She explained that she'd been experiencing symptoms similar to what I'd described, always after family dinners at her mother-in-law's house, and that her husband had been dismissive of her concerns. I brought him here tonight hoping he'd hear your story and understand that my worries aren't just anxiety or stress, she said quietly, glancing toward a man standing near the refreshment table who was pointedly avoiding eye contact with us. I spent 20 minutes talking with Sarah about documentation strategies, medical testing options, and safety precautions she could implement while gathering evidence. Most importantly, I emphasized that her instincts deserve to be taken seriously regardless of how her husband or other family members responded to her concerns. Your safety is more important than maintaining family peace, I told her, pressing a copy of my book into her hands along with contact information for local resources. Don't let anyone convince you to ignore symptoms or avoid seeking help. Trust yourself, document everything, and don't hesitate to involve law enforcement if you believe you're being deliberately harmed. As David and I drove away from Maple Grove the next morning, I felt a sense of closure that had been elusive during our years of recovery in Portland. Returning to the place where Patricia had nearly succeeded in killing me, and using that space to help other potential victims recognize and escape similar dangers, transformed the geography of trauma into a landscape of empowerment and purpose.